I am very honored to have here with me Mattias Desmet, who is a professor of clinical psychology at Ghent University in Belgium and a practicing psychoanalytic psychotherapist. He is an author of many books, one of the latest being The Psychology of Totalitarianism, which I read myself recently, and I must say that I believe that it is one of the most important books I have ever read, and I therefore encourage anyone who has not yet obtained a copy to do so very soon. Hello, Mattias. Thank you very much for joining me for this interview.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Frosti. Thank you for inviting me.
As I have told you before, I read your book and I was very moved by its message because to me it is such an incredibly accurate description of and analysis of many of the strangest things that our societies have been going through lately. So, well, you of course explain this very well in the book, but would you be willing to start by simply telling our listeners how you first started thinking about the psychology of totalitarianism?
Yes, it's always difficult to trace that back. Well, of course, well, I started thinking about the subject of totalitarianism back in 2017, I think, when I first knew that I would be teaching a course 5 years later on critics of culture and society. So I started preparing in 2017 for teaching that course in 2022. And immediately, so I had the impression, my central idea in 2017 was that what we call a totalitarian state, which is something entirely different than a classical dictatorship, but what we call totalitarianism or totalitarian states really is the main symptom of our culture. A few centuries ago, the religious view on man in the world was replaced by a materialist, rationalist view on man in the world, believing that the universe is a kind of a complex machine, a mechanical system, which can be perfectly understood, described, controlled, and manipulated through rational understanding. And this view on man in the world, in the end, within my theory, creates the problem of totalitarianism. And so what is totalitarianism? I just mentioned already that a totalitarian state is something completely different than a classical dictatorship. For instance, before the 20th century, there were classical dictatorships, many, but before the 20th century, there never had been a totalitarian state. The first totalitarian states emerged in the beginning of the 20th century. And the historically most important examples, of course, are the Soviet Union, which was the most totalitarian system ever, and Nazi Germany. And the difference with the classical dictatorship was that it was a psychological mechanisms involved. Like in a classical, the psychological mechanisms of a classical dictatorship are quite easy, quite simple to understand. There is a small group, a dictatorial regime, which is experienced as having a huge aggressive potential, and because of that, the population is scared of it and just accepts that this dictatorial regime unilaterally imposes its social contract to the population. That's, in a nutshell, and in a little bit a simplistic way, but the psychological mechanism of a classical dictatorship. In a totalitarian state, something completely different happens. In a totalitarian state, there first is a very specific kind of group formation in the population, which I called a mass formation, a crowd formation, or a mass formation. And like a mass formation is a kind of group formation which has very specific effects at the level of individual mental functioning. For instance, when people are in the grip of a mass formation, they typically become radically incapable of taking a critical distance of what they believe in. That's the first very strange thing. People literally start to believe the most absurd things. When the narrative the group believes in goes completely absurd, people just follow. And the second very important characteristic is that people who are in the grip of a mass formation typically become willing to radically self-sacrifice. So they are prepared to sacrifice everything that used to be important for them before the mass formation started. Their health, their wealth, the future of their children, even their own lives, it doesn't matter. They are prepared to sacrifice everything when the group, or when the narrative the group believes in, the ideology the group believes in, asks them to do so. And then the third and most important characteristic is that people who are in the grip of a mass formation become radically intolerant for dissonant voices. Mm-hmm. So they start to believe that it is their ethical duty to destroy each and everyone who doesn't go along with them. And that is the basis, that psychological process of where people start to fanatically believe in a certain ideology, usually disseminated by a group of leaders. And so this process is the basis of totalitarian states, and it makes totalitarian states extremely much more destructive and suffocating for a population than a classical dictatorship, just because the totalitarian state has a huge secret police, namely this part of the population, usually 20 to 30%, who blindly believe in the narrative and who are prepared to report everyone to the state who doesn't go along with them. So that's, in a nutshell, what totalitarianism is.
Yeah, and as you describe this, we can of course relate this to the recent corona crisis. It sounds like you're describing exactly what we were going through at the time.
Yes, indeed. You know, it's very strange. If you read the descriptions, the psychological experiences or the impressions of people who lived just before the emergence of Nazism and Stalinism, then they describe in exactly the way what they went through as what we've seen now happening during the corona crisis. Indeed, in the corona crisis, well, there was a virus and so on, but a narrative developed around this virus, which was in many respects absurd. For instance, the mortality rates, the initial mortality rates, were extremely overrated. And in the first week of the crisis, I wrote an opinion paper already, because I also have a master degree in statistics. I have a PhD in psychology, but also a master degree in statistics. And in the first week of the crisis, I wrote a paper already in which I expressed my doubt, in which I said, I think the calculation of the mortality rates are wrong. I think we overrated by 1,000%. And
you got attacked for that, or?
Can you come again?
And did you get attacked for expressing that view?
Of course. For me, it was clear that the virus couldn't be, or at least I really expected that it couldn't be as mortal as the mathematical models, for instance, of Imperial College claimed it to be. Because, for instance, the mathematical models of Imperial College predicted that by the end of May 2020, somewhere in between 60 and 80,000 people would die if in a small country such as Sweden, if Sweden didn't go into lockdown, and Sweden didn't go into lockdown, and only 6,000 people died. Mm-hmm. So meaning that, well, at that moment, by the end of May 2020, it was proven beyond doubt that me and several other researchers were right when we tried to warn society that the virus was not as mortal as they expected, and that probably the adverse effects and the consequences of the measures would be far more deadly and far more destructive than the virus itself. Mm-hmm. So by the end of May 2020, it was clear that the mortality rates had been extremely overrated, and still something very strange happened then. While everyone could see that the mathematical models had been wrong and that the initial statistics were completely wrong, the story the narrative just continued. It just continued as if the mathematical models had been right. And that was the moment for me when I started to focus on the psychological processes involved, the psychological processes which can make a population so blindly buying into a narrative, which in many respects is utterly absurd. Mm-hmm. And then I started my theory on mass formation, which tried to show people that indeed there are psychological processes which have exactly these effects on a population. And to be clear, for me, not only the people who bought into the mainstream narrative got in the grip of a mass formation. I think there were so-called, what I call counter mass formations as well. I mean, many people who didn't buy into the mainstream narrative also started to buy into quite absurd narratives. Mm-hmm. And that's what often happens. First, there is a major mass formation, which happens under very specific circumstances, which I describe very detailed in my book. But once the major mass formation starts, like a certain percentage of the population is immune to it, but that doesn't mean that they are immune for any mass formation. Like also these groups or find themselves in a very difficult psychological situation that very often they also start to believe in simplistic narratives which can explain what happens, and which can also be quite absurd, and which have exactly the same effects on them as the mainstream narrative has on the other individuals. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to mention that to understand the complexity of the situation and the polarization that took place in society.
Yeah, and what the psychological explanation of how this happens? I mean, what is it that causes almost entire societies to fall prey to mass formation, in your opinion?
Loneliness and disconnectedness. Yes, that's what I explain in my book. Like, mass formation has always existed. As long as mankind exists, mass formation exists. But for certain reasons that nobody really understood up until now, the mass formations became stronger and stronger throughout the last few centuries, let's say. And many people knew that it had something to do with the fact that throughout the last few centuries, more and more people started to feel isolated and lonely. But up until now, as far as I know at least, nobody provided a really coherent psychological explanation for what the connection was between loneliness and mass formation and why the loneliness increased throughout the last few centuries. And that's what I did in my book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. Yeah. Everything starts, I think, with this rationalist, materialist view on man and the world. Like, as soon as we started to believe that everything in life, or that the essence of life can be understood in a rational way, mm-hmm. Can be reduced to the categories of our rational thinking, we started to isolate ourselves from the essence of life. And then that in a strange way, we always believed that this rationalist, mechanist view on man and the world is a scientific view on man and the world, but that's just not true. Mm-hmm. Most major scientists, most seminal scientists, almost all of them, I think, concluded that the essence of life is irrational, that it can never be understood in a rational way. Mm-hmm. That's what the major physicists of the 20th century concluded, and even much more, the brilliant people who were the founders of complex dynamical systems theory and chaos theory. You can read it literally there. All complex dynamical systems in nature, in the end, behave as an irrational number in mathematics, and can never be, for instance, predicted in a rational way. It's impossible. There is a principle unpredictability, mm-hmm. rational unpredictability of these systems. And so the strange thing is that at the moment, you fanatically believe, as many materialists, mechanist thinkers do, that you can reduce everything around you to rational understanding. At that moment, you inevitably isolate yourself from the vibrating, resonating core and essence of life around you. And so something, and I explained that in much more detail in certain podcasts, and I think also in my book, in the last part of my book, something in fanatic rationalism isolates us mentally from our environment and from our fellow human beings. I could go into detail, but I won't do it now. That was one thing. And then secondly, this rationalist view on man in the world, this mechanist view on man in the world, led to the industrialization of society and the mechanization of society. And the industrialization of society and the use of excessive use of technology, for instance, is one of the most important explanations for the rise of loneliness. Like the introduction of television, radio, internet, reduced the number of real conversations between people. And while many people think that a technologically a conversation that is through technological means is almost the same as a real conversation, that's just not true. And in a real conversation, people really they physically resonate with each other. And I have been studying real conversations for a very long time at university. For instance, in a real conversation, people react to each other in less than 0.2 seconds. Can you imagine that? In traffic, the average reaction time is over 1 second. And in a conversation, people react to each other in less than 0.2 seconds. For instance, if the one person stops speaking, the other will usually start speaking in less than 2 seconds, even if the first person stops speaking.
There's a massive difference.
But that's wonderful.
So yes? we could trace this back, like you're referring to the Enlightenment era. I mean, with rationalist thinking of the likes of Charles Darwin and such. And has the decline of religion then something to is that a part of this evolution?
Well, it depends. Yes, I think so. And I think that religion doesn't provide a rational theory which claims to explain everything around us. So that it definitely has to do something with it. The replacement of the religious view on man in the world by the rationalist view on man in the world definitely is one of the major reasons, I think, for the emergence of loneliness, and then through a series of steps, a mass formation. But of course, I don't think we cannot go back to a dogmatic religious view on the man in the world. I think we don't have to go back.
No, the dogmatic religious view of the world is also some sort of a mass formation thing, isn't it?
Can also lead to mass formations, and it did lead to mass formations, for instance, to the Crusades. But these mass formations, for very specific reasons, were less strong and didn't last as long. So what happened in the 19th century was something very specific. People got more lonely, and inevitably, a lonely individual experiences a lack of meaning making. That's perfectly clear. People experience spontaneous meaning making every time they see that they have an effect on other human beings. So when they start to feel lonely, people also start to experience a lack of meaning making, and then they start to experience a lot of so-called free-floating anxiety, frustration, aggression, which means anxiety, frustration, and aggression that is not connected to a mental representation. And then they get in a state where they are very sensitive for narratives that are distributed through the mass media, indicating an object of anxiety and providing a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety. All their anxiety is coupled to that object of anxiety, and they have and they are willing to participate in the strategy to deal with that object of anxiety. For instance, lockdowns for a virus, even if that strategy is utterly absurd, just because through participation in that strategy, they feel in control of their anxiety again, and much more important, because so many people participate in the strategy to deal with the object of anxiety, they have the experience of fighting a collective, heroic battle with the object of anxiety. In other words, they feel connected again. They don't feel lonely anymore, which is an illusion, actually. But so, what I wanted to say is, religious view on man in the world led to mass formation, but it didn't create this enormous amount of loneliness. And the materialist view on man in the world did create this loneliness, did create lack of meaning making, did create all that anxiety, frustration, and aggression that is not connected to a mental representation. And that's why the mass formations were much stronger. And on top of that, when by the end of the 19th century, the mass media started to emerge, meaning that narratives that provided a strategy to deal with an object of anxiety could be distributed at an enormous level. And they could make, like, a mass formation will never continue to exist for a very long time if it is not supported and fed by propaganda. And the mass media provided an enormously powerful tool to propagandize the masses on a very long term, meaning that the mass formations, for several reasons, started to last much longer, and the masses could be manipulated in a much more efficient way. And that was the necessary precondition for mass formation to lead to totalitarian states. If a mass formation lasts for only a few months or only a few years, you can never establish a totalitarian state on the basis of that mass formation. You need a mass formation to continue for 10, 20, or 30 years, to use it as a psychological basis for a state system. And that suddenly became possible in the 20th century. Suddenly, due to a combination of facts, on the one hand, the fact that an elite emerged throughout the last few centuries, which used propaganda in a very excessive way to keep control of the population, and due to the fact that this elite had the mass media at its disposal, and due to the fact that the population was in this very specific state, isolated, lack of meaning making, anxiety, frustration, and aggression, this combination of factors led to what Hannah Arendt called the diabolic pact between the elite and the masses, which is the essence of a totalitarian state. And a totalitarian state, yes.
Do you believe that we have elites today that are willingly manipulating the situation, and we are being exposed to a lot of deceptive propaganda today?
No reasonable human being can doubt that. I think everyone knows that. If you look at the historical emergence of propaganda, then you see that it starts immediately after the French Revolution, which means the historical event in which the religious view on men in the world was replaced by the rationalist view on men in the world, and the historical event in which the ancient elite, noblemen and clergy, were replaced by a new elite. This new elite immediately knew that they just couldn't impose their will anymore to the population in an overt way. They just couldn't. The old elite could do that just because the religious few men in the world claimed that certain people were created by God to rule and others to obey. And so the old elite could just, without any without much justification, impose its will to the population. But the new elite, in this, which was based on this rationalist view of man in the world, couldn't do that anymore. In a materialist universe, there is no reason to be found whatsoever why the one kind of people would have the right to rule and the others to obey. So they found the solution to that. Of course, if you read the founding fathers of propaganda, such as Lippmann and Bernays, for instance, when you read their books, you see that they all start from this problem. We cannot control society anymore because we cannot impose our will anymore to society. Mm. So if we want to have control of society, then we have only one option. We have to make the people believe that they do what they want to do, but instead they will do what we have to. So we will have to manipulate them in such a way, to such an extent, that they do what we want them to do without them knowing that they do what they want them to do. That's a basic principle of propaganda. Read the books of the people who are at this moment still considered to be the founding fathers of propaganda. They will mention that. And so, the use of propaganda started immediately after the French Revolution. Napoleon established the first institute for propaganda, the Bureau d'Opinion Publique. Before that, there was also propaganda in the church, for instance, but that was of a completely different nature. It was something completely different. The modern propaganda, as we know it now, started then, after the French Revolution, and it became more and more and more important. And now, at this moment, we live in a public space which is constantly saturated with something that Jacques Ellul, for instance, would call propaganda. Definitely. And I agree with him. Like, we have all these techniques like nudging. We have the UN alone, United Nations alone, hired over 110,000 so-called digital first responders. That means people who attack every opinion that is not in line with the ideology the UN tries to impose to society. 110,000 were recruited in 2020 alone. So that's one very small example of the scale at which propaganda is used to try to make everyone conform to the ideology which is represented by the large global institutions.
And for instance, with the corona crisis, if we take your example for the statistical flaws in the mortality rates of the Imperial College papers, do you think that was willingly manipulated to deceive us, or what do you think about that?
You know, I'm someone who very often has warned people that many of these things were not intentional manipulation. In this respect, that, you know, if you look at it from outside of the academic world, you are convinced that no professor can make such mistakes. I've seen it in Belgium when I saw, for instance, how time and time again it was claimed that there was a new wave of corona, while it was clear, at least to me, that the new so-called wave of infections had nothing to do with a real rise of the number of infections in the population, but what was caused by the fact that more people were tested. Well, normally you would say, if you look from outside of the academic world, you would say, like, look, it's impossible that intelligent people, professors in statistics, make such mistakes, but it is possible. I can guarantee you that it is possible. When also these people were really in the grip of powerful psychological processes, and under these conditions, they can make the most stupid mistakes. And the higher the level of education, that's something important. The higher the level of education, the more easily people fall prey to mass formation. That was something that was already observed by Gustave Le Bon in the 19th century, and very well described. So that doesn't mean, of course, that everyone fell prey to mass formation, or at least that there were not people who. I do believe that there were people who manipulated in an intentional way, and they actually admitted it. They admitted it, that they have been manipulating the population.
Like who?
I could send you certain articles in which so-called experts admit openly that they have been manipulating the population. So there was both. There was at the one hand there was intentional manipulation. On the other hand, many of the academics and the experts just fell prey to the hypnotic effects of the mass formation themselves. And we have to be very careful, because if we believe that everything can be explained by intentional manipulation, we end up in a paranoid world. And if we ignore the evidence that shows that there was intentional manipulation, then we are just naive. So we have to try to distinguish very carefully between the two. It both exists, and we have to try to determine very well to what extent what we have gone through was caused by intentional manipulation, and to what extent it was caused by more organic emergent processes, such as mass hypnotic behavior. When you ask me about the models of Imperial College, well, of course, Neil Ferguson, who was involved in this, he was quite famous for time and time again predicting viruses who would claim an enormous number of casualties. And time again, it became clear that the viruses were far less mortal than he predicted. So I don't know, to be honest, Frosti, I'm very careful in that. I don't know him, I know I met several of the experts, and as soon as you meet them, you see that most of them just were in the grip of a narrative. But well, I would have to.
Yeah. You have also said that when you were studying for your master's degree in statistics, you studied the statistical quality of academic research, and you found that a very high percentage of it was flawed. Can you comment a little bit on all that? How were they flawed, and maybe in which field of research was this mostly?
Yes, well, I made my PhD about methodological problems in psychological research, and I started my PhD in 2003. And it was a nice coincidence in a certain way that exactly at that moment the so-called replication crisis started in psychology, a crisis in which it became clear that up to 60, 70, 80, 90% of the academic papers could not be reproduced. What does that mean? If a research group does a certain experiment or a certain academic study, investigation, and it gives its data, the data that it collected, to another research group, well, and up to 85, 90% of the cases, this second research group will find completely different conclusions, even when they start from the same observations.
How can that be? How can that be? Why is that?
Well, that's just, well, indeed, how can such be? And the problem was worse in medical research. In medical research, up to 85% of the papers couldn't be reproduced. That was very well described by John Ioannidis, who became world famous with that. But how can such be? Well, indeed, that's something for me that opened my eyes already, which showed me that very intelligent people can be in the grip, can believe in academic research that is utterly absurd. And I think it would be extremely interesting if people could do academic research themselves for 1 month or something. They would see that an academic researcher, for instance, when he is gathering his observations and when he is analyzing his data in a statistical way, that this researcher has to make choices. Like, no research is really objective, at least not in the medical sciences and in psychology and in sociology. In physics, it's slightly better, but it's also not perfect. In chemistry, it's a little bit better. But even in biology, the medical sciences, it's not, research just is rarely or never objective. That means that when you're doing your research, for instance, when you're doing a so-called randomized control trial in which you try to evaluate the efficacy of a certain medical intervention, well, such a trial is never really objective. I have done such trials myself. I know very well what I'm talking about. And in doing such a trial, you have to make like 1,000 choices, which are subjective in nature, which analytic method you will use, how you will replace your missing values, how you will deal with this and that problem. There is just no clear-cut rational answer to that. And in all these situations, a researcher makes a subjective choice.
So where
and time?
I'm sorry. I'm just thinking. I mean, where does that actually put us if the quality of academic research is next to nothing today, and we are inclined to follow academic research for every aspect of our lives, and it's if the quality is not there, I mean, where does that actually put us?
That's a very good question. I think it puts us in a situation in which we feel, in which there is no other option for us than to reconsider the most basic principles of our Enlightenment society. Our Enlightenment society believes that rational understanding should be the cornerstone of our human existence. And In its fanatic striving for rational understanding, it forgets that many phenomena just cannot be understood ultimately in a rational way. So I think you have to be much more careful. That's one thing. So you be just one thing that is one problem is that there is a limit to rational understanding. Certain phenomena, like our health, the reaction of a body to a medicament, the reaction of an individual to a psychological treatment, and so on, are so complex and dynamical in nature that there is just no simple answer, and that there is almost no way of really studying them in an objective way, be it only because the act of observation itself has a huge impact on the phenomenon that we observe. So that's one reason. Of course, there are several other problems as well. We all know that there was a huge publication pressure. We all that made many researchers publish findings in a distorted way, or just which made them overrate the effects they observed, and so on. So there were, the replication crisis was a very complex phenomenon. You cannot reduce it to one factor, but it definitely shows that the quality of our scientific research, of our academic research, in many cases is really dramatic, and that we would make a fundamental mistake by
what about
taking.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, but I'm now considering because there's a lot of sociology researches or fields that have impacted our Western societies in the recent years, and I'm thinking now about fields like gender studies or queer studies and critical race theory, and which some people find that are very dubious in nature. And do you think that studies in those fields with a lot of lack of quality have maybe somehow changed our societies for the worse, or something like that?
You have to distinguish, I think, between two things. The academic research that underpins these ideologies, the ideologies you refer to, or the theories you refer to, I think will suffer from a dramatic lack of objectivity and quality. And I don't even think that there is a solution to that problem, because we are dealing with phenomena which cannot be studied in an absolutely objective way. Definitely not. So that's one problem. But the other problem, of course, is the content of the ideologies itself. If certain ideologies start to claim that there is no biological difference between a man and a woman, and that it is a criminal act to distinguish between a man and a woman, well, then we have a serious ideological problem, I think.
Yeah.
On the one hand, we have the problem, which is not typical for these academic domains, which is much more, the problem that the scientific methods that are used lack objectivity and quality. So that's one problem. And that's not only a problem in the fields you mentioned there, it's also a problem in many other academic fields. But then there is a second problem, I think, the fact that many of these ideologies, while they sometimes started from real social problems, but they evolved in a direction where they go so absurd, in my opinion, and so extreme.
I agree.
That this in itself, this way of thinking, this ideological discourse, is a real problem, and also there we stumble upon that problem that many of the people who identify with these ideologies become extremely intolerant for people who think differently.
Exactly.
And yes, so that's and then as a society you end up in a problematic situation, because each human being needs people who think differently to remain in balance. And that's what happens when the degree of ideological intolerance becomes such that people with a different opinion cannot really have a decent conversation anymore with each other. Then you see how society drifts away and ends up in more and more extreme, intolerant and absurd ideological convictions. So I think, and indeed, if you look at the woke movement, if you look at the climate narrative now, If you look at the entire ideology, I think, which is represented by the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, well, then you see, I think, that this is typically an ideology which, with which people identify in a more and more fanatic way, which becomes more and more intolerant for dissonant voices, and which I think risks to be the basis for a future technocratic totalitarian system. That's what I try to warn for in that book.
These are perfect examples of where mass formation comes in. I mean, if we're in a society where stating that the genders are only two can get you in trouble and people attack you for that, that's how I understand it. That we are there in a grip of mass formation, right?
I think so. I think so too. I think so too. I think I use the term mass formation in a very in a technical way, of course. I use it, like for me, the first large-scale mass formation in recent history was the Corona crisis. Before the Corona crisis, we had examples of massification, which happened around the climate narrative, the terrorism narrative, and so on. But that was not a real mass formation. That was a precursor of a mass formation. In the Corona crisis, we had the first fully fledged mass formation, just because, for instance, in the Corona crisis, for the first time in recent history, we saw how two new groups emerged in society. A group that went along with the mainstream narrative, and then a group that didn't. And a dividing line between these two groups run straight through every family, every company, every group of friends, and so on. The energetic investment, the energetic qualities of the formation of these two new groups was so strong that it could redivide the entire social structure. And that's the characteristic of a real mass formation, I think. And what we're seeing now, I think, around such things as the woke movement and so on, is again an example of massification, a precursor of mass formation, but it could very easily, I think, also lead to a mass formation. And I think we have to. That's extremely important. We have to think about what we can do to prevent that these new mass formations go to the last level where people start to become so fanatically convinced of the ideologies they believe in that they really start to think that it is their ethical duty to attack and destroy everyone who doesn't go along with them. And that happens more and more. Like this week in Ghent, the city where I lecture at university, in Ghent, so-called social justice warriors or climate warriors, I don't know exactly, but it was one of these groups. They vandalized over 55 SUVs because they think it's unethical to drive a car with a high carbon monoxide production. So, I mean, you see that more and more people become fanatically convinced, and so convinced that I think it is their ethical duty to just attack everyone who thinks differently, or the property of everyone who thinks differently. So we have to think, and that's what I will describe in my next book that I'm writing now. We have to think about what we can do against mass formation.
Yeah. And what is it we can do? How can one protect himself from falling prey to mass formation?
Well, first and for all, whether you fall prey to it or not, I don't think you have a lot of choice. Some people just fall prey to it, others don't, and it has to do with the degree in which you try to find your stability, either in just taking the easy way in life and conforming to the group opinion, to the opinion of the group you belong to, or you can go the other way, the difficult way, and try to find your stability in life and your power in life by articulating the words that seem sincere and honest to you. So that's two different ways in which, as a person, you can try to feel a certain stability, psychological stability, a certain psychological strength. Mm-hmm. And so if you have the more you try to take the easy way, the more vulnerable you will come for mass formation. That's one thing. But the most important question, I think, is that when you see a mass formation happening around you, when you see how people become more and more totalitarian around you, what can you do as a person, as an individual? And I think the most important advice, I mentioned that time and time again, the most important advice I can give is that you have to continue to speak out in an as sincere, in an as honest way as possible. That's something that was also observed, for instance, already in the 19th century by Gustave Le Bon. He said, like, when a mass formation happens in society, there will always be a small group who doesn't fall prey to it. Actually, it's only 20 to 30% probably who falls prey to the mass formation, but there is always 65% of the people who just will shut up and who won't speak out against the mass formation, just because they always try to take the easiest way, which usually is to go along with the masses. But then there is a small group, 5%, 10%, it depends a little bit, who wants to do something and who wants to speak out. And these people have to try to speak out in the right way. They really have to understand that they will never succeed in waking up the masses. That's one thing. If you expect that the masses will wake up because of your rational counter-argumentation, then you will be disappointed. The masses won't wake up, usually won't wake up. It happens exceptionally that someone in the masses wakes up, but usually they won't. But, Gustave Le Bon said, that doesn't mean that speaking out, that your voice and your speech has no effect. Not at all, he said. If the people who do not go along with the mass formation continue to speak out in a quiet and a sincere way, without trying to convince the people in the masses, but just articulating their opinion in an as honest, as polite, but determined way as possible, then these people might indeed not succeed in waking up the masses, but their voice will prevent that the masses go, that the mass hypnosis, the mass formation goes to this ultimate stage where the people in the masses start to destroy everything. So that's crucial. It's just crucial. But historically speaking, that's exactly what you see. If the resistance, the people who do not fall prey to the mass formation, stop to speak out, the cruelty start, like that happened in the Soviet Union in 1935 and in 1930, and in Nazi Germany in 1935. The resistance went underground, stopped to speak out, and 6 months, 1 year later, the cruelty started. The system started to become extremely cruel. So that's the effect of speech.
Do you think there are certain individuals, or do you think you can identify some kind of patterns or character traits that are more likely than others to be immune to mass formations?
To be honest, I don't think so. Many people have tried to do so, and this question has been raised time and time again in every mass formation. What makes that certain people are immune to it? And nobody could provide a satisfying answer to that question. I think that in the end, the reason why certain people go along with the masses and others don't has to do with a choice which cannot be reduced to something else, not to the biochemical activity in your brain, not to the family you come from, not to the level of education, and so on. It's in the end, it's just this most fundamental choice a human being can make, which has to do with his relationship, his position with respect to a phenomenon that we call truth speech. It's this fundamental choice that determines whether you will go along with the masses, fall prey to the mass formation or not. Like, you have this as a human being. We all, from time to time, feel how certain words emerge in ourselves, in our belly, so to speak. We feel how something resonates within ourselves. And then we have a choice. We can try to articulate these words that emerge in ourselves and that we recognize as honest and sincere words. Or we can remain silent, just because by remaining silent, we won't damage this ideal image we hide behind when we enter public space. So it's this fundamental choice to choose to articulate the words that emerge and that we experience as sincere and honest words, or to choose not to articulate them. That's the most fundamental choice a human being can make.
But ultimately, it just comes down to who dares to speak out against a mainstream narrative. It can be very inconvenient to speak out when everybody is on the same thought of line of thought, if you can say.
Of course, it's always inconvenient to speak the truth. The ancient Greeks knew that already very well. The ancient Greeks knew that speaking the truth is always dangerous, because the truth, by definition, is a kind of speech which penetrates through the veil of appearances, which destroys a certain world of appearances that is created and that threatens to suffocate society. That's truth speech, exactly. It's this kind of speech which penetrates through the world of appearances. And that's always inconvenient. It's always, people always will blame you. Plato said something like, nobody is hated more than the one who speaks the truth. Yes, of course, we always have to be careful when we talk about the truth. Nobody possesses the truth. And the truth for me is something that you really feel, something in yourself, of which you say, like, look, this touches the strings of my soul and my body. I feel something here, and I will do my best to articulate it as well as possible without claiming that what I say is the ultimate truth, just claiming that I live up to the ethical duty to articulate something that to me, at this moment, seems sincere and honest. If we continue, so that's what truth speech is, I think. Indeed, it's always inconvenient to do so. That's true.
I have a personal theory, which is maybe highly irresponsible, but this is just like something that I observed during the height of the corona crisis here in Iceland, that the people that spoke out against the lockdowns and the policies, I felt they all had in common that they were slightly somehow different than the rest of the population. And I was wondering if you know, people, if they're maybe on some sort of an autistic spectrum or with a touch of Asperger, or they seem to be more resistant or maybe immune to this, and the normal people seem to be more easily absorbed in the mass formation phenomena, if you can.
Yeah, I think it's just the more conformist you are, the higher the chance that you will go along with the mass formation could be. On the other hand, and you people here in Belgium who were quite non-conformist and who bought into the mainstream narrative, and on the other hand, and you people who used to conform pretty well to social ideals and social narratives, and who didn't go along with the corona narrative. I think in the end, it's always very, very hard to predict who will fall prey to it or not. You could also say, like, sometimes it seemed as if the people who didn't go along with the narrative were the more traumatized individuals in society. That's also something that I heard from time to time. But I think, in my opinion, that's just a wrong way to interpret what what happened. The more people conform to society, the less visible their trauma is. Their trauma still is there, but it is hidden beneath the social images and the social ideals which they conform to. And the less people conform to society, the more overtly observable their trauma is. So I think in the end, in my opinion, it will always remain very hard to determine what the characteristics are of the group that doesn't fall prey to the mass formation. Like in the context of the Dreyfus affair in France, people also ask that question. Like in France, I believe that about 200 to 300,000 people didn't fall prey to the mass formation, which happened around the Dreyfus narrative that was distributed in the media. And many people, or at least there were certain scholars who asked themselves, like, look, what is the characteristic of these 200 to 300,000 people who do not fall prey to that mass formation? And they also couldn't answer it. They just observed that these people were an extremely heterogeneous group of people. They came from all kinds of social backgrounds and all kinds of families and all. Nobody could really tell what characteristics this group actually shared.
But so to take it all together, I mean, given the state of our mass media and now the social media, which is everywhere in the Western Hemisphere, would you predict that we will be seeing a lot more of mass formations in the future, or do you think that we are on some sort of a turning point, discovering what this is, and maybe we can fight back, or what do you predict, Mattias?
Oh, prediction is always difficult, and Niels Bohr said predicting is always difficult, in particular if it is about the future, he said. It's always difficult to predict what will happen, I think. But my 2-cent word opinion would be that mass formation will continue for a certain time, and we will see the emergence of a technocratic totalitarian system. We will the digital ID will be introduced, and they will try to introduce the central bank digital coins. They will try to impose a technological control system to society as the only solution for the chaotic situations that will manifest in the years to come. So yes, I think we will see how a totalitarian system tries to install itself and tries to seize control of society. But at the same time, I really believe that there will be a group of people who refuse to conform to the system, who refuse to participate, and who do their best to continue to speak out. And I do believe that this group of people, I see it everywhere around me. I believe that this group of people will succeed in preventing that the mass formation becomes so strong that the masses start to destroy everyone who doesn't go along with them. I really believe so. I have the impression that there are quite some people who are aware of the fact that there is something destructive is going on, and that they realize, these people, that we will need to resist and to do our best to continue to speak out, for instance. I do believe humanity will make it, to be honest. But I think the years to come will be difficult years. In the short run, I'm realistic, and in the long run, I'm very optimistic.
Well, I'm glad that you are optimistic, Mattias, and I thank you so very much for taking the time to do this interview. And while I encourage everyone listening to read your book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, I want to wish you personally all the best in the future. Mattias Desmet, thank you so much.
Thank you, Frosti, for inviting me. It was great to talk with you. And I also want to mention that people can also follow me on my Substack page if they want.
Yes.
I try to publish a small essay every week in which I comment on certain things that happen in the world. And that's also an opportunity to follow my work. And
absolutely.
Thanks again for inviting me. And maybe I hope to visit Iceland sooner or later. It would be great.
Yeah, we would love to see you here. Thank you so much, Mattias.